Hi, my name is Andrea Kupfer-Schneider, Professor of Law and Director of the Institute for Women's Leadership at Marquette University. In honor of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and in recognition of how important women are in this current election, we are delighted to bring you our virtual conference on women's suffrage and innovation. How is innovation linked with voting? To understand both the history of the women's suffrage movement and the current evolution of voting rights is to examine innovation in political activism, intellectual empowerment, and inventive women. We hope you will enjoy all 8 segments on this important subject. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, I'm Amber Wachowski, Associate Professor of Political Science at Marquette University. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Christina Wolbrecht, Professor of Political Science, Director of the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy, and the C. Robert and Margaret Hanley Family Director of the Washington Program at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Wolbrecht has graciously agreed to present 2 talks at the Institute for Women's Leadership, Suffrage and Innovation Conference. Professor Wolbrecht's research on women in politics is wide-ranging and path-breaking. In collaboration with Kevin Corder, she has written 2 books on women voters since suffrage. Her latest, with Dr. Corder, is A Century of Votes for Women, published this year by the Cambridge University Press. And in it, they offer an unprecedented account of how women voted and how politicians, journalists, and scholars understood women voters across the 10 decades since the 19th Amendment was ratified. Ms. Magazine notes in their review of the book, quote, "A consistent theme among candidates is that women's interests are fundamentally tied to motherhood and the home." But Wolbrecht and Corder argue convincingly that women are not just one kind of voter and are not mobilized only by their gender per se, end quote. Their earlier book, Counting Women's Ballots, also published by Cambridge University Press, used new data and innovative methods to analyze how women voted in the first 5 presidential elections following enfranchisement. It received the Victoria Shuck Award for the best book on women in politics from the American Political Science Association in 2017. Professors Wolbrecht and Corder have also received the Carrie Chapman Catt Prize for Women in Politics Research. Professor Wolbrecht's first book, The Politics of Women's Rights, published by the Princeton University Press in 2000, describes and explains the polarization of the 2 major American parties on women's rights issues, including abortion and the Equal Rights Amendment. It too was well received, winning the Leon Epstein Outstanding Book Award from the American Political Science Association in 2001. Her ongoing work with David Campbell, also at Notre Dame, looks at women in the contemporary moment, how women act as political role models, particularly for adolescents. She is the author of numerous articles and book chapters and a prolific public scholar, writing pieces for the broader public that have appeared in Newsweek, The Washington Post, Fox.com, and many others. She recently served as an advisor on PBS's American Experience documentary, The Vote. She's a current co-editor of Politics and Gender and the founding executive board member of Women Also Know Stuff, an initiative to advance women experts in political science. Her service to her students and the profession, her staunch advocacy of women in political science, and her rigorous and insightful research have shaped countless women's lives and how we see ourselves and our place in politics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Wolbrecht to the Institute for Women's Leadership Suffrage and Innovation Conference. Her talk, Looking Back, Women's Suffrage in American Politics, is the 3rd in our series.
Hi, I'm Christina Wolbrecht. I'm a political scientist at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm really pleased to be with you today to talk a little bit about women's suffrage and American politics. What I want to do in this presentation is just give you a sense of what the fight for suffrage looked like, but in doing so to talk specifically about women's political identity, their place in American politics, and how women shaped American democracy in their struggle to obtain the right to vote. All right. So I want to start by talking a little bit about women in the early American Republic. And one thing I want to start with that I think we often forget is that the Constitution of the United States, as ratified in 1789, is quite silent on voting rights. The US Constitution ensures a Republican form of government, which is understood to be a government in which the people play a role in selecting their representatives, but it says very little about who can vote, or virtually nothing about who can vote, how voting is to take place, how ballots are to be counted, etc. In the United States to this day, the administration of voting rights remains largely a state power. There are, of course, some amendments now that put limits on things that states can and cannot do in terms of voting rights. But for the most part, the states decide how they're going to run elections, who's going to be eligible, etc. Now, what that means is that the US Constitution did not explicitly say that women did not have the right to vote. It also didn't explicitly say that men did have the right to vote. It is entirely clear, however, that the founders, those who were writing and ratifying the American Constitution, expected that for the most part, women were not part of the eligible electorate. Now, from the very beginning, as we sort of famously know, there have been women who have been pointing out that this is sort of deeply problematic. And so the famous letter that Abigail Adams writes to her husband, John Adams, who's participating as a delegate at the Constitutional Convention, asking him to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. The reply that John Adams sends Abigail Adams starts with, "I could but laugh," which gives you a pretty good sense of how most of the framers were thinking about the idea that women would be sort of full and equal citizens at the time of the founding. This actually presented something of a problem. This is a new form of government in which the power of the state is based on the consent of the people. What then is women's role in this American Republic? And I should be very clear, what I mean right now is, of course, white women's role. Native women, African-American women, for the most part, well, entirely, had no voting rights, very little access to the ballot, as well as did, of course, no access to the ballot at all, Black men as well. But if we think of this as a system sort of founded on the consent of the governed, no role for slaves, no role for indigenous folks, what's the role then for white women if they're not voters like everyone else? And what historian Linda Kerber and others have argued is that at the time of the founding, there becomes this idea of what's been called Republican motherhood, that women need to stay out of politics and be free of political ambition so that they can focus on positive virtues. They are caring, they are ethical, they're honest. And as a result of sort of being secluded away from politics, they're able to offer wise counsel and support for their husbands that go out and do battle in the public arena. And they are able to raise patriotic sons who will be soldiers, who will be voters, who will be leaders in this new political society. And so the role of women in politics at the time of the founding is really a dependent one. It's a supported one. The job of women is not to speak their own voice or to shape politics directly, but to work indirectly to play these roles for their husbands and their sons, of course, to raise their daughters to do the same. That's going to be challenged almost immediately, but I think it's important to start there, in part because our ideas about women in politics and the presumptions we have, a first lady role sounds a lot like this vision of Republican motherhood, for example, still remain very deeply informed by these ideas from the time of the founding. There's a lot of words on this slide. Here's what I want you to also understand. At the time of the founding, Americans inherited the idea of coverture from British common law. What coverture means is that when a man and a woman are married, the man covers the woman legally. I have a line down there from Justice Hugo Black. Coverture worked out in reality to mean that though the husband and wife are one, that one is the husband. What that meant is that women could not own the property that they brought into marriage. They could not inherit, could not claim their own wages, did not have legal control over children in or out of marriage, couldn't sign legal documents, could only testify at court with the permission of their husbands, and could not testify against their husbands, because if you're a legal one, you cannot testify against yourself. This is going to be important because when we think of what became the women's suffrage movement, really begins as a broader movement that seeks to address these real legal and economic and social challenges that women face under the law as it was working in the early part of the 19th century. So, as I've suggested, we start to see writing and advocating on behalf of this problem. Even men are able to see that when their mothers cannot inherit property or cannot pass down property, that lack of, or if their wives are not able to make money and have some independence, this is causing lots of economic and social stress. And so even before we get to sort of Seneca Falls, or when we all think of the women's suffrage movement beginning, we start to see, again, these are all state laws, a series of what are known as Married Women's Property Acts being passed in the states from 1839 onwards. Lots of inequality, lots of gender inequality stays in the law, but across the 19th century, a number of those most egregious aspects of coverture are changed by state governments. This, of course, brings us to, if we're going to talk about the women's suffrage movement, we most commonly start with the Women's Rights Convention that was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. It's important to note that this date is both too late. As we've seen, there was already some advocating for women's rights prior to 1848, including some talk about women having the right to vote. It's also much too early. We're going to see that Seneca Falls happens. There's some activism that happens before that. But for the most part, we don't see a huge growth in a women's suffrage movement until after the Civil War. This was a convention called by the abolitionists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. The famous story is that they met at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London years earlier, a convention at which women, despite their previous activism, were not allowed to be seated as delegates. And so instead, Elizabeth and Lucretia walked around London and talked about sort of the unfair treatment of women in the world political system. It is important to note that most of our knowledge about the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention comes from the white suffragists themselves, Stanton and Anthony in particular, who wrote the first history of women's suffrage. And so while Seneca Falls certainly deserves its place in history, we don't want to overstate what a role that it played. It was one of many conventions that were ongoing at that time to address a variety of social ills, including women's rights. The document that came out of the Seneca Falls Convention is known as the Declaration of Sentiments. It was modeled explicitly on the Declaration of Independence, and so it includes a list of women's grievances as well as a list of demands. There was only one of those demands that was not supported unanimously by those attending the convention, and that was the demand for women's right to vote. This was seen as a step too far, as too ridiculous, that it would make the entire event a laughingstock. It was Stanton, along with famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who emphasized that for women to achieve all the other rights, to get better laws that would treat them more fairly, greater equality, etc., that the vote was an absolutely key tool for women to be able to achieve that, and that everything else, in a sense, flowed from the vote. And so that demand, that plank of the Declaration of Sentiments did pass, but quite narrowly. The response to the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls was widespread ridicule and censure by politicians, by pastors from their pulpits, and so on. I also want to mention that we actually do not own, and when I say we, I mean the US government, the US archives, history centers, etc. There is no version of the Declaration of Sentiments that has survived. And in fact, the archives is still calling, they have a sort of an official call out for people to scour their great-great-grandparents' basements and other places. And if anyone can find an original copy of the Declaration of Sentiments, that would be quite an addition to American history. So as I said, there's not a whole lot of real organized activism for women's suffrage in advance of the Civil War. But it is after the Civil War that we really start to see a movement, a nationwide movement emerge to gain the right to vote for women. One of the very first places that sort of comes up is immediately after the suffrage war in the conflict over the 15th Amendment. The so-called Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, were passed in the years following the Civil War. The 15th Amendment explicitly gives, or let me be more clear, the 15th Amendment prohibits the denial of voting rights on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Many suffragists, including Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had hoped for an equal rights, an equal suffrage amendment that would not just expand voting rights to cover Black men, but would cover white and Black women as well. This becomes quite a serious source of dissension and conflict within the sort of emerging American women's suffrage movement. Those who supported, they said, as Frederick Douglass famously said, this is the Negro's hour, formed one separate movement for women's suffrage. Those who felt that they could not support a 15th Amendment without the inclusion of gender or sex formed a separate women's suffrage movement or organization. Those two organizations will immediately join as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, but that will take several decades after the 15th Amendment. This is, of course, part of a broader conflict within the suffrage movement about supporting true equal suffrage, that is to include people of color all over the United States, or to narrowly focus on women and specifically white women. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. So what we get is sort of this explosion of women's activism and lobbying in the second half of the 19th century. For the most part, the initial movement really focuses on the state level. As I've said, that's where voting rights are really organized and administered. And so there are these state-by-state campaigns year after year after year to try to convince state legislatures or male voters who are voting in referendum to support women's suffrage. And so I have examples here of flyers, of different events that are held, and all the efforts that women went into, suffragists went into to try to convince men basically to give them the right to vote. And that's another sort of key takeaway point I would want to emphasize. Every expansion of suffrage is always something of a puzzle. Why would those who have political power, in this case through the ballot, give up some of that power, or share some of that power with people that are currently excluded? And we can think about that in terms of racial voting rights. We can think about that in lowering the voting age, and we can think about that in terms of women's suffrage. Earlier in the 19th century around the world, the expansion of suffrage to men who didn't own property, for example. And so trying to understand why women were ultimately successful, I think we need to have that question in the back of our heads. So the state campaigns were slow. There were many more losses than there were successes. For the most part, losses tended to, victories tended to be concentrated in the western part of the United States. I want to note, however, that in this map, there are only 4 states, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado, in which women had the right to vote prior to 1900. So I'm talking about a movement that starts, towards the end of the Civil War, 1860s, 40 years later, by 1900, there's really only 4 states where women have full suffrage prior to 1900. There again in the West, it's worth saying that Wyoming is the first state to grant full suffrage to women, and they do so upon their founding. So Wyoming has never denied women the right to vote, but they entered statehood with equal suffrage for men and for women. In the 20 years leading up to the ratification of the 19th Amendment, more states tend to fall, but you'll again see that those that next category of states with full suffrage from 1900 to 1919 still is overrepresented in the West. Those states like Michigan and particularly New York fell very closely or very quickly right before the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And so New York does not enfranchise women until 1915. That's an incredibly key success. New York is a large, very highly populated state, and the victory there really made a national amendment seem quite inevitable for many. There is definitely a regional pattern. You'll see in the Midwest and the upper Midwest, there's a lot of enfranchising women to allow them to vote in specific offices, but not in others. Through most of the South, and particularly what we would refer to as the Deep South, women are never granted the right to vote in advance of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. I do want to talk a little bit about Black women suffragists specifically. Many of the suffragists whose names are common or well known are, of course, white suffragists. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul. I could go on and on, but I will not. This can give the false impression that the movement was primarily led by and dominated by white women. Certainly the white women's organizations like the National American Women's Suffrage Association were in fact dominated by and led by white women. Because they were quite systematically excluded from most white women's organizations, Black women formed their own suffrage organizations and made their own appeals for the right to vote. Martha Jones, the historian Martha Jones, in a new book she has coming out with this title, has referred to Black women as the vanguard. And what she argues is that by imagining true equal suffrage, where both women and people of color had the right and ability to vote, they had an even broader and more aspirational view of what the American electorate could look like. This is, of course, the height of Jim Crow politics in the South. Black men and women, Black men particularly, are systematically excluded from ballot polling places in the American South. And of course, part of what we're seeing in the exclusion of Black women from many white women's suffrage organizations, programming, and events is a concern over the threat that they pose to the South. White Southerners feared that they would not be able to use the same strategies and tactics of violence to keep Black women from polling places as they had kept Black men from polling places. I'm sorry to tell you that after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, there was not much reluctance to use the exact same violence and the same tactics to continue to exclude Black women as well. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. I should also say there were suffragist organizations among working class women, among Indigenous women, etc. And one of the great things about this centennial is that we're getting more and more of these really important but long lost stories about the true diversity of the American women's suffrage movement. So given how slow the states are going, by about the turn of the century, most of the sort of larger suffrage organizations are increasingly convinced that a constitutional amendment is the way to go, that state-by-state campaigns will take too long, won't be successful in many places, etc. And so what we start to see in the early part of the 20th century is much more of a national campaign, using various sort of techniques to try to convince national legislators to pass an amendment that is exactly worded on the wording of the 15th Amendment, but using the word sex in replacement for race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and therefore to prohibit the denial of voting rights on the basis of sex across the country. What we really see in this period is two different directions that suffrage activism goes. And this makes the suffrage movement incredibly similar to lots of other social movements, where we see parts of that movement working within more traditional political structures and engaged in sort of more traditional political strategies. And we often see another part of that movement that wants to push harder and faster and might use more militant or what some people view as extreme political tactics. So that's certainly what happened here. So the national organization, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, really applied a lot of traditional pressure. And their winning plan, as it was known, was based in part on the idea, as this picture suggests, that the growing numbers of enfranchised women in the West could provide political pressure on national legislators to enfranchise women in those remaining states. There are those women who are begging to come and be saved by their sisters in the West. And certainly there's some good evidence that this is mattering. It is important to note that as late as 1920, the American West remained quite underpopulated. I happen to know, for example, that Wyoming had about 120,000 people total in it in 1920, and even California, now such a large and important state politically, was not nearly the size and impact population-wise, and therefore in the House of Representatives, as we would expect it to be today. I want to talk a little bit about the innovation that women put forward in their fight for suffrage. And here I mean not just in those last 20 years, but in sort of the history of the suffrage movement as well. A lot of the political strategies and tactics that seem quite normal and commonplace to us were new and in many ways innovated by women, particularly in the suffrage movement, although women also innovated in other places where they wanted to shape politics, the temperance movement, progressive movement, etc. In the 19th century, when we talk about politics, what we really mean is party politics. Parties organized legislatures, they organized voters. Voters had a very strong sense of identity tied to parties. If this sounds familiar, we're in another period like this again. And really, the way that you exercise political power and political influence was by organizing voters. If you could get enough votes, if you knew that you controlled this county, or that the dock workers would vote for you, or that the farmers in this state were going to line up behind a particular candidate, that's how you were able to change politics and get things done, right? And so these are some famous pictures of a stump speech from the 1850s out there trying to make his argument to his fellow citizens. The other thing to understand about politics in the 19th century is that these were incredibly masculine spaces. Today, when we go to vote, we think of a nice office, maybe at a park or in a church or at a school, and a very bureaucratic, straightforward procedure. Many people now have to wait in line much too long, but in general, you go in, you get your ballot, you vote, you leave, it's 5 minutes. In the 19th century, voting was an all-day activity. Voting often took place in saloons and bars and other sorts of public places where honestly, respectable women were not supposed to be or to be part of, right? And so one of the reasons it was hard for Americans to imagine women as voters is that in their mind, you went to the vote all day, there were military marches, there were parties, there was drinking. The party might be there, you know, handing out ballots and handing out a dollar bill or a shot of whiskey to people for taking their ballot. As that suggests, it's also the case in the 19th century that governments did not print the ballots, but rather you got a ballot from the party you wanted to support. It was often in a different color, so people could tell how you were going to vote, and you placed it in the ballot box. And so what I want you to notice particularly about these pictures is there's no women in them. These are male spaces. So these are men organizing other male voters, appealing to other male voters, and these are men sitting around outside the saloon voting on election day, okay? So women don't have access to the primary form or tactic for political influence in the 19th century, and so they really had to innovate, and they innovated in a lot of different ways, right? If you can't elect the policymakers, if you can't have an ear of the policymaker because you made sure that all the farmers or the dock workers or the factory workers voted for that politician, what you're left with is what we think of quite common today, which is direct lobbying, right? So women who are, right, not supposed to go in the political world, supposed to be outside of the political arena, getting dressed up, going down, making appointments with city councils, with state legislatures, eventually with senators and members of the United States House of Representatives, and making their case. This is why you should support women's suffrage, right? I can't promise you voters, well, not right now. I can't promise you voters, but I will make my case to you directly. Women also innovate in basically trying to directly shape public opinion. So if I myself cannot vote on a referendum to give women the right to vote, or I myself cannot elect legislators who will give women the right to vote, what I can do is try to influence the men who can, right? And so this is numbers of pictures all over the country of women speaking, and if you look out, there are lots of hats there, right? They're not trying to convince women, because the truth is women don't have a lot of power, and certainly not the power to enfranchise themselves. But they're speaking to men and trying to make the case for giving the right to vote to their fellow female citizens. Women also engage in marches and protests. Again, those are activities that seem fairly commonplace today, but were not nearly as commonplace in the 19th century. This particular picture is from a 1913 march in Washington, D.C. At that point, certainly one of the biggest sort of public events like this that had ever been held in the nation's capital. It happened the day before, excuse me, I'm thinking of a different march. No, I'm thinking the right one. It happened the day before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, and in fact took a lot of the attention to that. This was so unusual and so shocking that women would march for their own rights, that this march is going to end in something of a riot. Men in the crowds, as you see them drinking heavily after not very much time at all, began attacking women in that protest. As I suggested, we also see, particularly in the last decades before the 19th Amendment is ratified, a rise in sort of militant action, and this is also often associated with Alice Paul. That's actually Lucy Byrne, not Alice Paul in the picture. Women were, in fact, the very first citizens to protest in front of the White House. Again, fairly commonplace for the last certainly 50 years, but was absolutely unheard of when women began doing this in the 19-teens, organized by Alice Paul and other, for lack of a better word, more militant suffragists. They maintained that picket standing outside the White House even during World War I, which drew lots of challenges to their patriotism. Everyone should be involved in the war effort. On the other hand, as the United States fought to, as President Wilson said, make the world safe for democracy, the effectiveness of their protest of pointing out that in the United States there were citizens who lacked a role in democratic government was also an effective political tool. At one point, police started to arrest protesters. They were put into jail. They endured terrible treatment, including forced feeding, etc. That also garnered a lot of sympathy for suffrage activists as well. They also leverage gender in really important ways, and it's something I always want to talk to my own students about thinking about how gender both constrains and provides opportunities for political voice and political activism. These pictures happen to be from that 1913 march. This is Inez Mulholland on the bottom, riding the white horse in the white dress, symbolizing all sorts of ideas about Columbia and the purity of women and their leadership and their sort of role in this country, right? And above you have sort of this, the sort of stalwart, thinking back to all sorts of historical images of the sort of strong woman and her place in the nation. Inez Mulholland went on to give lots and lots of speeches all over the country in defense of women's suffrage. She actually became so sick doing so that she collapsed while giving a suffrage speech and died, becoming sort of a martyr for the suffrage movement. So, as I said, we have this national campaign. We have that traditional political pressure. We just saw some examples of that. We also have a rise in militancy and protest, as I was just talking about. And again, these are the pickets outside the White House, and then women who are sleeping in jails as a result of their protest. By 1920, the women's suffrage movement achieves its ultimate goal, the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, which says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. There are a lot of factors that contribute to the success of the 19th Amendment. It is fought in the states. It is fought in the state in our nation's capital. It has been fought in the states again through the process for ratification. And one of the things I think the centennial helps remind us is that voting rights are consistently contested to this day. They are continually fought for, they're retracted, they're expanded, but every generation, in a sense, has to sort of remake that claim to that fundamental role of the citizen in a democratic government. With that, I'm going to conclude. I hope that that was helpful in thinking a little bit about women's suffrage as a political movement and its impact on politics in the United States. Thanks.
On behalf of the entire Planning Committee, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Please check out the other segments of our conference on our website. And please do let us know how you utilized the resources provided. Our feedback form and email address are also located on our website. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, remember to vote.